Welcome to The Forgotten Soldier by Guy Sajer, a gripping and deeply personal story of a young soldier caught up in the chaos of World War II. It's raw, emotional, and pulls you right into the life of someone who lived through one of the most brutal fronts of the war, the Eastern Front. These are his words. Let's begin. The first night of retreat was complicated by a fine rain, which required of Ernst and me the agility and balance of acrobats simply to keep our Tatra in the wake of the Mark IV. Without the tank, we would never have been able to escape from that swamp. The driver stepped on the accelerator in fits of irritation, dragging the Tatra, which threatened to disintegrate. The tank treads churned the ground into a heavy syrup, which the rain thinned into soup. The windshield became completely caked with mud, and Ernst waded through the liquid ground to scrape it away with his hands. The blacked-out headlight had been left with only a narrow strip uncovered. Within a few minutes, this strip was sealed by mud, so that we had no light at all. I couldn't even see the back of the tank, although it was no more than 5 yards ahead of us. Our truck, more often than not at an oblique angle to the tank, was constantly being pulled back into line by the tightly stretched chain. Each time this happened, I wondered if we still had our front wheels. Behind us, the wounded had stopped moaning. Maybe they were all dead. What difference did it make? The convoy moved ahead, and daylight dawned on faces haggard with exhaustion. During the night, the convoy had spread out. It no longer seemed to matter whether we were ahead of schedule or behind. The driver of our Panzer suddenly turned off to the right, leaving the track, which had become impassable even for a tank, and drove straight up the scrub-covered bank, crushing the sodden birches under his treads. Our truck, whose wheels by this time were balls of mud, was pulled forward, while its engine rattled helplessly. Then everything came to a complete halt. This was the second stop since our departure. We had stopped once in the night to gas up. The poor bastards on the back of the tank jumped down among the broken branches. Their backsides had been burning all night on the hot metal over the engine, while the rest of their bodies froze in the cold rain. An exchange of shouted abuse, which was nearly a fight, broke out at once between a non-com in the engineers and the Panzerführer. Everyone else took advantage of this opportunity to crap and eat. 1 hour's rest, shouted the non-com, who had taken on himself the leadership of the group. Make the most of it. Fuck you, shouted the Panzerführer, who had no intention of being pushed around by some half-baked engineer. We'll leave when I've had enough sleep. We have to get to Belgorod this morning, the non-com said in a steely voice. He undoubtedly nourished dreams of being an officer. Then putting his hand on the Mauser, which hung at his side, he added, We'll leave when I give the order. I've got the highest rank here, and you'll obey me. Shoot me if you like, and drive the tank yourself. I haven't slept in 2 days, and you're going to leave me the hell alone. The other flushed crimson, but said nothing. Then he turned to us. You two, instead of standing there asleep on your feet, get into the truck and help the wounded. They have their needs, too. That's it, added the tank driver, who was clearly looking for trouble. And when they're finished, the Herr Sergeant will wipe their asses. You watch it, or I'll report you, snorted the sergeant. He was now white with rage. Inside the truck, the wounded had not died despite the jolting of the journey. They were no longer making any noise, and we could see that some of their bandages were soaked with fresh blood. Fighting the exhaustion which made our hearts race, we helped them down and back as best we could, omitting only one man who was missing both legs. They all asked us for something to drink, and in our ignorance we gave them as much water or brandy as they wanted. We certainly shouldn't have done this. 2 men died a short time later. We buried them in the mud with sticks and their helmets to mark their graves. Then Ernst and I curled up in the cab to try to snatch a little sleep, but sleep wouldn't come, and we lay instead with throbbing temples, talking of peace. 2 hours later, it was the tank driver who gave the order to depart, as he had predicted. It was now mid-morning. The day was clear and bright, and large chunks of snow fell slowly from the trees. Ha, he said, our general left us all while we were asleep. Maybe he felt like taking a walk. It seemed that the non-com really was gone. He must have managed a ride in one of the trucks that had passed us during our rest. That shit has gone to make his report, shouted the tank driver. If I catch up with him, I'll drive right over him, flatten him out like a goddamn Bolshevik. It took us a while to extricate ourselves from the bank we had driven into. However, 2 hours later, we arrived at a hamlet whose name I no longer remember, some 5 miles from Belgorod. It was filled with soldiers from every branch of the army. The few streets were perfectly straight and lined with low houses. The way the roofs sat on the walls reminded me of heads with no foreheads, whose hair grows right into the eyebrows. There were swarms of soldiers and a multitude of rolling equipment covered with mud, pushing through the shouting mob of soldiers, most of whom were looking for their regiments. The road at this point had been roughly resurfaced and was much more negotiable. We unhooked ourselves from the tank and took on 8 or 10 of the engineers who had been riding on its back. Somewhat bewildered by this flood of soldiers, I had stopped the truck and was looking for my company. 2 MPs told me they thought it had gone on toward Kharkov, but as they weren't sure, they sent me to the redirection center, which had been organized in a trailer and was staffed by 3 officers who were tearing their hair. When I was finally able to catch their attention through the thousands of shouts and gesticulations besieging them, I was harshly reprimanded for straggling. They probably would have sent me to be court-martialed if they'd had time. The disorder was incredible, and the Lancer, half furious, half joking, flooded into the Russian huts. We might as well sleep while we wait for all this to settle down. All they wanted was a dry corner where they could lie down, but there were so many men crammed into each izba that there was almost no room left for the Russians who lived in them. Not knowing what to do with myself, I went to find Ernst, who had gone to look for information. However, he had run into a truck hospital and had returned to the Tatra with an orderly who was checking over our wounded. "They can go on as they are," he said. "What?" Ernst asked. "But we've already buried 2 of them. At least we should give them fresh dressings." "Don't be stubborn and stupid. If I label them urgent, they'll have to wait their turn, lying in the street. You'll get to Belgorod quicker than that and escape the trap that's closing on us." "Is the situation serious?" Ernst asked. "Yes." So Ernst and I found ourselves responsible for 20 wounded men, some of them in critical condition, who had already been waiting several days for essential medical attention. We didn't know what to say when a man grimacing with pain asked us if he would soon be at the hospital. "Let's get going," Ernst said, frowning anxiously. "Maybe he's right. If I'd ever thought it would be like this." I had been at the wheel for only a few minutes when Ernst tapped me on the shoulder. "Come on, little one, stop. You'll finish somebody off if it goes on like this. Hand over." "But I'm supposed to drive, Ernst. I'm the one who's in the driver's corps." "Never mind. Let me do it. You'll never get us out of here." It was true. Despite my best efforts, the truck was jolting and sliding from one side of the road to the other. We arrived at the village exit point, where there was an interminable line of vehicles waiting for gasoline. Thousands of soldiers were walking up and down on either side of the road. An MP ran over to us. "Why aren't you waiting like everybody else?" "We've got to leave right away, Herr Gendarme. We're carrying wounded, and that's what the infirmary told us." "Wounded? Serious cases?" He spoke in the doubting, disbelieving tone of every policeman in the world. "Of course," said Ernst, who certainly wasn't exaggerating. "The policeman had to peer under the canvas anyway. They don't look so bad to me." There was a furious outburst of swearing. From time to time, wounded men availed themselves of their special position to abuse the police. "You son of a bitch," groaned one man, who was missing a piece of his shoulder. "It's shits like you who should be sent to the front. Let us through, or I'll strangle you with the one good hand I have left." The feverish Lancer was sitting up in spite of his pain, which made him frighteningly white. He seemed quite capable of putting this threat into action. The policeman flushed, and his nerve faltered at the sight of these 20 battered wrecks. The position of a big city policeman roaring at some pathetic bourgeois for going through a red light is a far cry from that of an MP behind the lines dealing with a gang of combat veterans who are holding their guts in with their hands or have just bayoneted the guts out of somebody else. His display of bad temper turned into a set little smile. "Get out of here," he said, with the air of someone who doesn't give a damn. When the wheels of the truck began to turn, he vented the last of his spleen. Go and die somewhere else. It was hard to get even 8 gallons of gasoline, and when we managed it, our tank swallowed them in an instant, but we were glad to take what we could and get out. A feeble attempt had been made at surfacing the road, but there were still long stretches of bare ground which had become deep quagmires to be avoided at all costs. We proceeded on the highway, or beside it, as circumstances required. We kept passing vehicles abandoned in the mud because of mechanical failure or because they had run out of gasoline. A short distance along the new road, we were stopped by a group of about 50 Lancer, on foot and in a state of unbelievable filth. They took our truck by storm. "Make room for us, fellows," they said, hanging on as hard as they could. "You can see that we haven't got any room," Ernst answered. "Let go." But we couldn't get rid of them. They swarmed over the tailgate, trampling on our wounded to try to make them move over. Ernst and I shouted at them, but it didn't do any good. They piled on everywhere. "Take me," whimpered a poor devil, scratching at my door with bloody hands. Another waved a pass which was already almost expired. The arrival of a Steyr, followed by 2 trucks, restored order. An SS captain climbed out of the Steyr. "What's this ant heap? No wonder you've broken down. It's impossible. There must be at least 100 men here." The men scattered immediately without asking for anything more. Ernst saluted and explained the situation. "Very good," said the captain. "You take 5 more along with your wounded. We'll take another 5, and the rest will have to walk until the convoy comes by. Let's get going." Ernst explained that we would be out of gasoline in a few minutes. The captain signaled to some soldiers on the Steyr, who gave us 6 gallons. A few minutes later, we were on our way again. We kept passing groups of men wading through the mud who begged us to pick them up, but we didn't stop. Toward noon, with our last drop of gasoline, we reached a town where a unit was being assembled for the front. I escaped becoming an infantryman before my time by a hair's breadth. We had to wait until the following day before we could use the reserve of 5 gallons of gasoline which Ernst was able to draw. We were about to leave when an unexpected and unpleasant sound struck our ears. In the distance, still quite far away, we heard the booming of big guns. As we thought we were by now far from the front, we were both astonished and alarmed. We didn't know, and I didn't know until much later, that our course had been taking us parallel to the Belgorod-Kharkov line. Nonetheless, after unloading 2 dying men to make room for 3 more wounded, we set off without delay. In the middle of that afternoon, everything went wrong again. Our truck was more or less in the middle of a column of 10. We had just passed an armored unit whose tanks looked like a giant version of the slimy creatures that emerge on mud flats at low tide. They must have been on their way to meet the enemy, who seemed to be very close. We could hear artillery on our left, despite the loud, laboring noises of the trucks. Ernst and I exchanged anxious looks. We were stopped by some soldiers who were setting up an anti-tank gun. "Dig in, fellows," shouted an officer as we slowed down. "Ivan's getting pretty close." This time, at least, they were telling us something. But I wondered how the Russians, who had been left some 90 miles behind, could already be in this district. Ernst, who was driving, stepped on the gas. 2 other trucks did the same. Suddenly, 5 planes appeared in the sky at a moderate altitude. I pointed them out to Ernst. "They're yaks," he shouted. "Take cover." We were surrounded by bare mud, with occasional clumps of stunted brush. There was a sound of machine gun fire from the sky. The column drove more quickly toward a shallow fold in the ground which might give some protection. I was leaning out the window, trying to see through the flying mud spun by our wheels. 2 Focke-Wulfs had appeared and had shot down 2 of the yaks, which crashed far to the west. Until the final stages of the war, Russian aircraft were no match for the Luftwaffe. Even in Prussia, where Russian air power was its most active, the appearance of 1 Messerschmitt 109 or 1 Focke-Wulf would make a dozen armored Ilyushin bombers turn and run. At this period, when German air power still possessed important reserves, the lot of the Russian pilots was not enviable. 2 of the 3 remaining yaks had taken flight, pursued by our planes, when the last dived straight at the convoy. One of the Focke-Wulfs was chasing him, and was plainly trying to get him in his sights. We reached the dip in the road. The Soviet plane had come down very low to use its machine guns. The trucks ahead of us had stopped short, and the able-bodied were jumping down into the mud. I was already holding the door open, and I jumped with my feet together, plunging face downward, when I heard the machine guns. With my nose in the mud, my hands on my head, and my eyes instinctively shut, I heard the machine gun and the two planes through a hellish intensity of noise. The sound of racing engines was followed by a loud explosion. I looked up to watch the plane with the black crosses on its wings regain altitude. 300 or 400 yards away, where the yak had crashed, there was a plume of black smoke. Everybody was getting up again. "One more who won't give any trouble," shouted a fat corporal who was clearly delighted to be still alive. Several voices joined in a cheer for the Luftwaffe. "Anybody hit?" one of the non-coms called out. "Let's get going then." I walked over to the Tatra, trying to brush off the worst of the mud that clung to my uniform. I noticed 2 holes in the door I had opened to get out, which appeared to have swung shut on its own momentum. 2 round holes, each outlined by a ring of metal from which the paint had been scraped away. Nervously, I pulled open the door. Inside, I saw a man I shall never forget, a man sitting normally on the seat, whose lower face had been reduced to a bloody pulp. "Ernst?" I asked in a choking voice. "Ernst!" I threw myself at him. "Ernst! What? Say something! Ernst!" I looked frantically for some features on that horrible face. "Ernst!" I was nearly crying. Outside, the column was getting ready to leave. The 2 trucks behind me were impatiently blowing their horns. "Hey!" I ran toward the first of the trucks. "Stop! Come with me! I've got a wounded man!" I was frantic. The doors of the truck behind me swung open and 2 soldiers stuck out their heads. "Well, young fellow, are you going to move or aren't you?" "Stop!" I shouted louder than ever. "I've got a wounded man." "We have 30, one of the soldiers shouted back. "Get going. The hospital isn't too far from here." Their voices rose over mine, and the noise of their trucks, which had pulled out and were passing me, drowned my cries of desperation. Now I was alone, with a Russian truck loaded with wounded men, and Ernst Neubach, who was dead or dying. "You shits, wait for me, don't go without us." I burst into tears and gave way to a mad impulse. I grabbed my Mauser, which I'd left in the truck. My eyes were swimming and I could barely see. I felt for the trigger and, pointing the gun at the sky, fired all 5 cartridges in the magazine, hoping that to someone in the trucks this would sound like a cry for help. But no one stopped. The trucks continued to roll away from me, sending out a spray of mud on each side. In despair, I returned to the cabin and ripped open my kit to look for a package of dressings. "Ernst," I said, "I'm going to bandage you. Don't cry." I was insane. Ernst wasn't crying. I was. His coat was covered with blood. With the dressings in my hand, I stared at my friend. He must have been hit in the lower jaw. His teeth were mixed with fragments of bone, and through the gore I could see the muscles of his face contracting, moving what was left of his features. In a state of near shock, I tried to put the dressing somewhere on that cavernous wound. When this proved impossible, I pushed a needle into the tube of morphine and jabbed ineffectually through the thicknesses of cloth. Crying like a small boy, I pushed my friend to the other end of the seat, holding him in my arms and soaking in his blood. 2 eyes opened, brilliant with anguish, and looked at me from his ruined face. "Ernst!" I laughed through my tears. "Ernst!" He slowly lifted his hand and put it on my forearm. Half choked with emotion, I started the truck and managed to begin moving without too great a jolt. For a quarter of an hour, I drove through a web of ruts with one eye on my friend. His grip on my arm tightened and eased in proportion to his pain, and his death rattle rose and fell, sometimes louder than the noise of the truck. Choking back my tears, I prayed without reason or thought, saying anything that came into my head. "Save him. Save Ernst, God. He believed in you. Save him. Show yourself." But God did not answer my appeals. In the cab of a gray Russian truck, somewhere in the vastness of the Russian hinterland, a man and an adolescent were caught in a desperate struggle. The man struggled with death, and the adolescent struggled with despair, which is close to death, and God, who watches everything, did nothing. The breath of the dying man passed with difficulty through that horrible wound, making huge bubbles of blood and saliva. I considered every possibility. I could turn back and look for help, or force the men I was carrying to tend Ernst, at gunpoint if necessary, or even kill Ernst, to cut short his sufferings. But I knew very well I couldn't kill him. I had not yet been obliged to fire directly at anyone. My tears had dried, leaving the trace of their passage on my filthy face to betray my weakness to the world. I was no longer crying, and my feverish eyes stared at the knob on the radiator 2 meters in front of me, which cut hypnotically into the interminable horizon. For long moments Ernst's hand would tighten on my arm, and each time I was overwhelmed by fresh panic. I couldn't look at that horrifying face. Several German planes passed overhead through the cloudy sky, and in a desperate attempt at telepathy, every fiber in my body appealed to them for help. But maybe they were Russian planes. It didn't matter. I had no time to spare. No time to spare. The expression assumed its full significance, as so many expressions do in wartime. Ernst's hand gripped my arm convulsively. The pressure continued for so long that I slid my foot off the accelerator and stopped, afraid of the worst. I turned and looked at the mutilated face, whose eyes seemed to be fixed on something the living can't see. Those eyes were veiled by a curious film. My heart was pumping so hard that I felt actual physical pain. I refused to believe what I could guess without difficulty. "Ernst!" I shouted. From the back of the truck, my shout was answered by several others. I pushed my companion down on the seat, imploring heaven to let him live, but his body fell heavily against the other side of the cabin. Death. He was dead. Ernst. Mama, help me. In a delirium of terror, I leaned against the truck door and then let myself drop, trembling, onto the running board. I tried to persuade myself that none of this was happening, that it was all a nightmare from which I would wake to see another horizon. As I sat and thought, I still had no idea of the extent of irremediable evil. I dreamed of what life would be like when I shook off this horrible nightmare in which my friend had just died, but my eyes could see only mud sucking at my boots. 2 heads looked out from the back of the truck. They were saying something, but I didn't hear them. I stood up and, turning my back on them, walked off a short distance. That small physical effort reawakened some sense of life and hope, and I tried to tell myself that all of this wasn't really serious, that it was only a bad dream I had to forget. I tried to impose an expression of smiling derision on my features. 2 of the wounded men jumped down from the truck to relieve themselves. I stared at them unseeing while the vitality of being alive beat back the darkness. I began to think with hope that surely all the German soldiers in Russia would be sent to help us, that something must be coming to help us. Suddenly I thought of the French. They were already on their way. All our newspapers said so. The first legionnaires had already set out. I had seen the photographs. I felt a hot flush run through me. Ernst would be avenged, that poor fool who had never hurt a fly, who had spent his time making life more endurable for wretched soldiers shaking with cold. And his marvelous hot showers. The French would come, and I would run to embrace them. Ernst had loved them like his own compatriots. This surge of hope and joy could not be damped by facts I didn't know, like the fact that the French had decided on quite another course. "What's happened?" asked one of the men, whose gray bandage was falling over his eyes. "Are we out of gasoline?" "No. My friend has just been killed." They looked into the cabin. Well, that's not so bad. At least he didn't have to suffer. I knew that Ernst's agony had lasted for nearly half an hour. "We ought to bury him," one of them said. The 3 of us lifted out the body, which was already stiffening. I moved like an automaton, and my face was without expression. I saw a small rise of ground which was less trampled than everywhere else, and we took Ernst there. We had no shovels, so we dug the grave with our helmets, rifle butts, and bare hands. I myself collected Ernst's identity tags and papers. The other 2 were already pushing back the dirt and trampling it down with their boots when I looked my last on that mutilated face. I felt that something had hardened in my spirit forever. Nothing could be worse than this. We pushed in a stick at the head of the grave and hung Ernst's helmet on it. I slit the stick with the point of my bayonet and slid in a piece of paper torn from the notebook Ernst always carried with him, inscribed naively in French. Ici, j'ai enterré mon ami, Ernst Neubach. Then, to forestall another emotional crisis, I turned and ran back to the truck. That concludes the 9th part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.